The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 3 creaked open, and every head turned as the young woman stepped inside. She looked out of place in her simple navy blue suit and low-heeled black shoes, more like a librarian than someone tied to a high-profile trial. A thin silver chain peeked out from beneath her collar, glinting briefly under the fluorescent lights as she walked to the witness stand. The room buzzed with low murmurs. Journalists hunched forward with their notepads. A pair of local news cameras panned to follow her every step. She didn't acknowledge any of them. Her eyes stayed on the wooden rail of the stand, as though that spot alone kept her grounded. Judge Howard Reeves, a tall, square-shouldered man with silver-rimmed glasses and a reputation for impatience, adjusted himself in his high-backed chair. He tapped the edge of his gavel against the block, a subtle warning to the restless crowd. "State your name for the record," he said in a measured but authoritative tone. The young woman inhaled quietly, her fingers tightening around the rail. Her lips parted, yet the words stalled somewhere in her throat. The judge's brows knit together. "Miss, the court needs you to speak up." "Please state your full name." Still nothing. Just the faint tremor of her hands and the sound of papers shuffling at the defense table. The attorneys exchanged uneasy glances. A cough broke the silence from the gallery. Someone whispered, "Why isn't she saying anything?" Another voice answered, "Nerves, maybe." Reeves cleared his throat, this time allowing an edge of irritation to slip through. "This is a court of law. We can't proceed until you identify yourself. Speak clearly so the court reporter can record it." All eyes fixed on the witness. Her face remained composed, but her gaze stayed lowered as if weighing something far heavier than a simple introduction. Reporters poised their pens, anticipating her reply. Even the bailiff shifted his stance, sensing an unusual tension building around a moment that should have been routine. A tense silence hung in the air after the judge's second request. The witness's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard, her eyes briefly darting toward the gallery before fixing once again on the polished wood of the stand. Judge Reeves adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, speaking with a firmness that carried the weight of decades on the bench. "Miss, this court will give you one more opportunity. State your legal name for the record." A low murmur rippled across the benches behind the bar. Journalists sat upright, fingers poised above keyboards, waiting to catch the first syllable that would define the headline of the day. The young woman's voice finally broke the silence. Soft at first, as if testing its own courage. I'm known as Echo 7. The courtroom collectively blinked. Even the court reporter paused mid-keystroke, glancing up as if unsure she'd heard correctly. "Excuse me?" The judge's tone shifted from stern authority to sharp disbelief. "My name," she repeated, still quiet but steadier now, "is Echo 7. That's what I've been called for years. It's the only name I can give." Gasps and confused whispers surged through the spectators. A man in the second row let out a baffled laugh before quickly covering his mouth. Reeves tapped his gavel twice. "Order! I asked for your name, not a call sign. This is a court of law, not a radio tower." Echo 7, if that truly was her name, straightened slightly, her shoulders squaring as if she'd been expecting the disbelief. "With respect, Your Honor," she said, her words still measured but tinged with steel. "My legal identity is classified. I served under this call sign for most of my career. It's who I am, and the only name I can provide without violating federal security protocols." An audible stir swept the courtroom again. The prosecutor's brow furrowed. The defense attorney raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the claim. "Classified?" the judge repeated slowly, each syllable clipped. "Are you telling this court that revealing your given name is a threat to national security?" "Yes, sir," Echo 7 replied, unwavering now. "There are operations, missions that remain sealed. My testimony is tied to one of those missions. My legal name appears in documents that haven't been declassified. Revealing it publicly would compromise ongoing work and potentially endanger others." The judge exhaled slowly, drumming his fingers on the bench. The murmur in the courtroom refused to die down. "Bailiff," Reeves said, motioning to the officer at his right. "Restore order or I'll have the gallery cleared." The bailiff raised his hand, and the room quieted reluctantly, curiosity still buzzing like static in the air. Across the aisle, a reporter whispered to her colleague, "Did she just say she's classified?" Her colleague whispered back, "Sounds like some spy thriller stuff. If it's real, this story's going viral." Ignoring the commentary, Reeves leaned forward again. Miss Echo 7, this court has procedures. The law requires witnesses to be properly identified. I can't allow testimony from someone who refuses to give a legal name. The defense has a right to know who's speaking against them. Echo 7 met his gaze at last. Her eyes were sharp but not hostile. Your Honor, I'm not refusing. I'm protecting people who once stood beside me. If I expose my identity, I expose theirs. I'm here because the truth I carry can't stay buried, but it has to be told under the name that was forged in service. For the first time, the judge's stern expression flickered, an almost imperceptible crack in his composure. One of the jurors shifted in her seat, clearly intrigued. The defense attorney rose from his chair. Your Honor, he said, gesturing toward the witness, this is unprecedented. We cannot cross-examine a code name. Either she reveals her legal identity or her testimony should be stricken from the record. The prosecutor countered immediately. Your Honor, the witness was subpoenaed by federal request. She's under protective guidelines. We ask for a brief recess to clarify her clearance status. The judge held up his hand, silencing both. We're not pausing yet. I want to understand what we're dealing with before I grant or deny anything. He turned back to the witness. Miss Echo 7, you're saying you've served in operations serious enough to warrant classified protection, yet you're willing to testify in open court. Why now? She inhaled deeply, her fingers loosening their grip on the rail. Because what happened the night of the incident led to the death of an innocent civilian. That night ties directly to the defendant sitting here today. I couldn't stay silent any longer. But the name on my birth certificate doesn't matter to this testimony. What matters is what I witnessed as Echo 7. The tension in the room thickened, and the judge's jaw tightened as he weighed her words. He rapped the gavel lightly, more thoughtful than angry this time. Very well, he said at last. The court will take your statement under your call sign for now. But understand, your credibility will be scrutinized at every turn. Proceed carefully. In the gallery, a hush fell as the gravity of the exchange settled over everyone. The young woman who'd seemed so timid minutes earlier now stood taller, the title Echo 7 ringing in their ears like a puzzle begging to be solved. The moment Judge Reeves allowed her to testify under her call sign, the room shifted. The gallery's murmurs quieted to a low hum, the reporters' pens moved faster, and the defendant, an imposing man in an expensive charcoal suit, leaned back in his chair, a slow smirk spreading across his face. Defense attorney Martin Cole rose deliberately, smoothing his tie before stepping toward the witness stand. Your Honor, he began, his tone silky but edged with skepticism. Before I ask my first question, I must object to this arrangement. My client deserves to face his accuser by name. A nickname cannot carry the same weight as a sworn witness. The judge's gavel landed with a crisp rap. Objection noted, Mr. Cole. You may question the witness, but we've already ruled she may proceed under her call sign. Make your point relevant or move on. Cole gave a curt nod, pivoting to Echo 7 with the practiced smile of a man used to cornering his opponents. Echo 7, he said, dragging out the call sign with a hint of mockery. Let's start with something simple. How long have you been hiding behind that code name? She met his gaze without flinching. I'm not hiding behind it. I've used it in service for 9 years. My legal identity is sealed by federal order for the protection of ongoing operations. Cole spread his hands dramatically for the jury. 9 years. Ladies and gentlemen, we're being asked to believe the word of someone who hasn't used her own name for nearly a decade. Doesn't that raise a question of accountability? The jurors shifted uneasily. One frowned, another scribbled a note. Judge Reeves interrupted. Counselor, ask questions. Don't argue your case yet. Of course, Your Honor. Cole took another step closer, lowering his voice so it carried a subtle taunt. Miss Echo 7, you testified you were present the night of the incident. Yet you expect this court to trust you without knowing who you are, where you're from, or what qualifies you as a credible witness. So tell us, what exactly were you doing there? A faint tremor crossed her face, but she clasped her hands in her lap to steady herself. I was assigned to observe a covert transaction linked to illegal arms trafficking, she said steadily. I can provide coordinates, timestamps, and coded transmissions, everything relevant to that night. Cole arched an eyebrow. Convenient that you alone seem to hold all these details. Do you have proof, or do we just take the word of someone named after a CB radio? A ripple of nervous laughter rolled through the back row until the judge shot a glare that silenced it. Echo 7 kept her tone calm. but there was an edge to her words now. There is proof. Some of it has been declassified and submitted to the prosecution. Some remains under seal for national security, but I will provide what this court permits. Cole leaned one elbow on the witness stand's rail, close enough to seem intimidating, far enough to remain proper. So we're supposed to trust that somewhere in a locked federal vault sits the evidence that magically supports your story? How convenient for you. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman named Lila Grant, rose immediately. Objection argumentative and disrespectful. Sustained, said Reeves, striking the gavel again. Mr. Cole, step back. Cole straightened but smiled faintly at the jury, planting seeds of doubt as he retreated to his table. Lila approached next, switching the energy of the room. Her voice was clear, measured. Echo 7, without revealing classified information. Can you tell the court why you were sent to monitor the defendant specifically? The witness nodded. The defendant's company was suspected of funneling weapons into conflict zones. That night, we tracked a shipment scheduled to exchange hands at the docks. I was in position to record the deal when it went wrong. What went wrong? The buyer tried to back out. An argument escalated. Shots were fired. An innocent dock worker was caught in the crossfire. I saw the defendant give the order to clean it up before fleeing the scene. A collective gasp rippled across the courtroom. The defendant's smirk faltered, his lawyer whispering furiously into his ear. Cole shot up again. Objection, hearsay. Overruled, Reeves said. The witness was present. Cole clenched his jaw but sat down, clearly annoyed. Echo 7's gaze softened briefly as she added, That man's family still doesn't know the full story of why he died. That's why I'm here. The room grew still, the earlier skepticism replaced by a tense curiosity. Judge Reeves studied her for a long moment before speaking. Miss Echo 7, this court understands the weight of your testimony, but I'll remind you the burden of proof remains on the prosecution. Continue answering clearly and truthfully. For the first time since she'd entered the courtroom, Echo 7's posture relaxed just slightly. Yes, Your Honor. The judge glanced at the clock. We'll recess in 10 minutes. Counselor, one last question before we adjourn. Cole rose again, voice cutting through the thick silence. Echo 7, if you're so determined to bring justice, why hide your real name? What are you afraid of? She looked at him steadily, her expression unreadable. I'm not afraid for myself, she said quietly. I'm afraid for the people who once stood beside me. Some of them are still out there, still serving. If my name becomes public, so do theirs. And that could cost lives. The room went so silent the ticking of the courtroom clock was audible. Judge Reeves rapped the gavel lightly. We'll break for recess. Court resumes in 30 minutes. As the spectators rose from the benches, reporters whispered urgently into their phones, already drafting headlines. Witness known only as Echo 7 links defendant to fatal dock shootout. In the witness chair, Echo 7 sat still for a heartbeat longer. Her call sign echoing in the minds of everyone who'd heard her speak. No longer a strange nickname, but a name that carried weight and a story yet to be told. When the court reconvened after recess, the mood had shifted. The once skeptical gallery returned quieter, subdued by the gravity of Echo 7's testimony. The defendant's smirk had all but disappeared, replaced by a stiff jaw and restless tapping of his fingers on the table. Reporters gathered at the edges of the room, their phones poised for live tweets. The hum of speculation was electric. What kind of witness could face down a defense attorney so calmly while guarding her own name like a national secret? In the back row sat a man in a weathered leather jacket, his grizzled beard framing a face hardened by experience. He leaned toward the middle-aged woman beside him and whispered, Echo 7. I swear I've heard that call sign before. Back when I was stationed overseas. The woman's brows arched. Overseas? Military? Special forces, he muttered. We'd sometimes hear about operators with single-digit call signs, real ghosts. If she's Echo 7, she's the kind they send where no one else dares go. The woman glanced at the witness stand with new eyes, her earlier skepticism replaced by curiosity and a touch of awe. Up front, Judge Reeves struck the gavel lightly. Court is back in session. Prosecution, you may continue. Prosecutor Lila Grant rose, carrying a file thick with notes but never glancing at them. Her gaze stayed locked on Echo 7. Before we resume the timeline of the incident, Lila said, I'd like to ask the witness to clarify her background without revealing classified details, to help the jury understand her expertise. Defense attorney Cole immediately stood. Objection relevance. Her supposed background isn't proof of anything regarding the night in question. Reeves shook his head. Overruled. The jury has a right to know the qualifications of a key witness. Proceed, Ms. Grant. Echo 7 shifted slightly in her seat. I can share only what's been cleared for public record, she began, her tone crisp yet restrained. I served 12 years in military intelligence. The last 9 of those I operated under the call sign Echo 7 for a joint task force branch tasked with monitoring illegal arms networks. My record includes commendations for covert fieldwork and crisis response. Beyond that, details remain classified. A murmur fluttered through the jury box, impressed, skeptical, uncertain all at once. Lila nodded. So when you say you were trained to observe covert exchanges, that training was part of official government operations? Yes, ma'am. Observing, documenting, sometimes intervening, but always in accordance with federal directives. Cole let out a scoff loud enough for the jurors to hear. In other words, she's a professional spy, he said under his breath. Strike that. Counselor, Reeves warned, but his sharp tone only made a few jurors hide restrained smiles. Lila stepped closer to the witness. Given that background, would you say you're skilled at reading high-risk situations? Yes, Echo 7 replied without hesitation. Identifying threats, tracking illegal exchanges, those skills kept me alive. At that moment, the man in the leather jacket leaned forward again, whispering to another veteran seated 2 rows ahead. She's legit. I'd bet my pension on it. We had intel on Echo Team operatives years ago. They were ghosts in the field. The whispers started to spread. Small fragments of rumor carried like wind through dry grass. Bits of sentences, special forces, covert ops, decorated operative, passed from row to row, and soon the gallery's collective posture shifted. Less derision, more respect. Judge Reeves noticed the ripple of movement. I'll remind the gallery to remain silent or be removed. This is not a spectator sport. The murmurs died down at once, but the change lingered. People no longer looked at Echo 7 as a frightened young woman. They were now staring at someone extraordinary. Lila resumed her questioning. Echo 7, earlier you stated that you witnessed the defendant at the docks the night of the fatal shooting. At any point did you make contact with him directly? No, she said. My protocol was surveillance only. I was not to engage unless the threat escalated beyond containment. Did you report what you saw that same night? Yes, I transmitted encrypted audio and video to our secure channel at 02:13 hours. The next morning, my field report was logged. Cole leapt to his feet. Your Honor, none of this so-called evidence has been shown to the defense. We can't verify these alleged transmissions. Lila countered swiftly. Some of those files are sealed pending federal review, but enough has been released to establish a timeline consistent with the witness's account. The judge's brow furrowed. Mr. Cole, you'll have access to any material cleared for this case. Sit down. Reluctantly, Cole obeyed, but his clenched fists betrayed his frustration. Echo 7 continued. The reason I didn't come forward sooner in person was that my unit was still operational. My superiors feared exposure would compromise ongoing missions. But after the civilian casualty and the mounting evidence implicating the defendant, I was released from the field to testify. Her voice didn't waver, but her fingers brushed the silver chain around her neck as if for reassurance. A juror in the front row leaned toward another and whispered, She sounds credible to me. Not like someone making it up. Their exchange didn't escape the notice of Cole, whose eyes narrowed. To break the tension, Reeves addressed Echo 7 directly. You've carried this call sign for most of your adult life. Does it hold personal meaning for you? She hesitated a fraction of a second. It represents a promise I made to my team, to be their voice when they couldn't speak. I intend to keep that promise today. For a moment, the courtroom fell silent, the weight of that answer settling over everyone. Even the defendant shifted uncomfortably. His earlier bravado eroded by the subtle power of her calm composure. Lila nodded slowly, choosing to end the line of questioning there. No further questions at this time, Your Honor. Judge Reeves announced a brief break for the jurors to stretch before the cross-examination would resume. As the gallery stirred again, the whispers rose in renewed waves, this time tinged not with ridicule but with something closer to admiration. The grizzled veteran in the back row muttered to himself, "Echo 7, I knew there was more to that name. Whoever she is, she's the real deal." The silver-haired judge watched her quietly as she stepped down from the stand for the short break. For all his decades on the bench, it wasn't often a witness changed the entire atmosphere of a courtroom without even raising her voice. The gavel's sharp crack echoed as Judge Reeves called the courtroom back to order. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Once everyone settled, Reeves looked toward the defense table. "Mr. Cole, you may proceed with your cross-examination." Cole stood with a measured confidence, adjusting his tie as though preparing for battle. His earlier frustration had been replaced by the smooth demeanor of a man who knew how to manipulate doubt. He strolled to the center of the courtroom, eyes never leaving the witness stand. "Miss Echo 7, he began, pausing as though the name itself were an insult. "You've painted yourself as a decorated operative, impressive. But we're not here to hear war stories. We're here about a single night at the docks, so let's focus." Echo 7 met his stare without flinching. "I'm ready," Cole paced slowly. "You say you observed my client committing a crime, yet you never approached him, never identified yourself, never intervened. Instead, you claim you sent an encrypted transmission at—" He glanced at his notes theatrically. "Shiu 2 13 hours. Convenient. That means there's no one to corroborate your presence except for these classified files you keep referring to." "Isn't that right?" Her reply was steady. "The protocol was to observe and report, not to reveal myself or engage. The files corroborate my statement. Files that you admit we can't see in full," Cole shot back. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we're being asked to take her word for it. That's not evidence, that's faith." He let the words hang in the air, turning toward the jurors as though he'd planted a seed of suspicion. Judge Reeves cut in. "Mr. Cole, this is not a closing argument. Stick to your questions." Cole nodded politely, hiding a smirk, and faced Echo 7 again. "Let's talk about your identity. You expect us to believe you spent 12 years serving this country, and yet cannot disclose your real name because of operational security." He leaned on the witness stand's rail. "Tell me, witness, are you even who you say you are?" A few gasps rippled through the gallery. Echo 7 didn't blink. "I'm exactly who I say I am. I've given the court everything I'm legally permitted to share." Cole's smile tightened. "So you won't even confirm your birth name?" "That information is restricted. Revealing it could endanger ongoing missions and the safety of my former team." Cole threw up his hands. "Ah yes, the mysterious team, always conveniently unnamed." Lila Grant rose. "Objection. Counsel is mocking the witness instead of questioning her." "Overruled," Reeves said, though his tone carried a warning. "Mr. Cole, move along." Cole's tone grew sharper. "Fine. You claim you saw my client exchange a duffel bag at the docks the night of the shooting. From how far away?" "Approximately 40 meters. And the lighting conditions?" "2 overhead lamps intermittent plus vehicle headlights during the drop-off." He pounced. "Intermittent light at 40 meters in the dead of night, yet you're absolutely certain it was my client?" "You must have superhuman eyesight." "I had night-adapted optics," she replied evenly. "Standard-issue field equipment." Cole hesitated for a second, clearly not expecting that answer, but recovered quickly. "Even with your optics, how can we be sure you didn't misidentify someone? A mistake like that could destroy an innocent man's life." "I don't mistake faces," Echo 7 said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the room like a blade drawn across steel. A hush spread across the gallery. Even the defendant shifted in his chair. Cole's expression hardened. "We're supposed to take your word on that again, aren't we? The word of someone who hides behind a call sign. You could be anybody. A ghost story soldiers tell around campfires." "Objection," Lila interjected, badgering the witness. "Sustained," Reeves ruled. "Rephrase, counselor." Cole leaned back slightly, feigning composure. "Very well. Did you ever meet my client prior to that night?" "No." "Did you speak with him during or after the alleged incident?" "No." "Did you at any point record his voice, his license plate, or obtain a single fingerprint that ties him to this supposed exchange?" "I recorded video of the exchange itself, which has been submitted in part to the authorities. Audio was also captured." Cole raised an eyebrow theatrically. "In part submitted. So once again we have to rely on what's been cherry-picked for us by the prosecution." The jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Then Cole went for the jugular. You testified that your call sign represents a promise to your team. Noble words. But isn't it true that you've never testified in open court before, meaning we have no track record of your credibility under oath? That is correct, Echo 7 admitted, her voice calm. I've never been called to testify publicly until this case. Cole spun to the jury with a flourish. First time on the stand, can't reveal her name, can't show all the evidence, yet we're told to trust her as the linchpin of the prosecution's case. Does that sound reliable to you? Lila stood to object again, but Reeves waved her down. Let him finish this line, Ms. Grant. The jury will decide what's reliable. Cole turned back to Echo 7. Last question, for now. You've sworn under oath that you were there. If it turns out you're lying, you understand the penalty for perjury could be prison time. Echo 7's reply was immediate, her eyes unwavering. I understand, and I have nothing to fear from the truth. For a moment, silence swallowed the courtroom. Cole studied her face, perhaps hoping to find a crack in her composure. There was none. He finally said, "No further questions at this time," and returned to his seat, his expression betraying a flicker of frustration. Judge Reeves dismissed the jury for a short recess before redirect examination. As they filed out, the gallery buzzed with hushed conversations, some skeptical of Echo 7's secrecy, others admiring her resolve. The man in the leather jacket whispered to the woman beside him, "I've seen that kind of steel before. You can't fake it. She's telling the truth." Up front, Lila Grant quietly flipped through her notes, preparing to rebuild the trust Cole had tried to chip away. She knew that in the next phase, she'd have to reveal something more, something that would restore the jury's confidence in Echo 7 and leave no doubt about her integrity. For now, though the witness sat silent, hands folded, gaze steady, like a soldier accustomed to holding her ground until the next battle. The courtroom reconvened after the recess, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind the jurors as they returned to their seats. A muted buzz followed them. Everyone could feel that the tide of the trial was about to shift. Judge Reeves straightened his robe and nodded at the prosecution table. Ms. Grant, you may proceed with redirect. Lila Grant rose with calm determination. Her earlier frustration at the defense's attack on Echo 7 was gone. In its place was the poise of a lawyer who knew she still held cards unseen. She approached the witness stand slowly, every step deliberate, as if telling the jury that the next few minutes would matter more than all that had come before. Echo 7, she began, her voice steady. Earlier you were asked about your experience in the field and whether you had ever testified in court before. You answered honestly, no, but that does not mean you have never been evaluated for credibility. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct, Echo 7 replied. Lila took a step closer. Please explain to the jury what kind of evaluations you underwent during your service. Echo 7 clasped her hands loosely in her lap. All covert operatives in my unit were subject to quarterly psychological assessments, reliability screenings, and polygraphs for mission-critical operations. We were also evaluated by military tribunals whenever there were questions about protocol breaches. I passed every evaluation without issue. A ripple of interest spread across the jurors' faces. Lila nodded and continued. And during those 12 years of service, did you ever have a single incident of disciplinary action or formal reprimand? No, ma'am, Echo 7 said. My record is clean. Lila turned slightly toward the jury. So when you say you do not mistake faces, it is not a boast but a trained skill, one that was tested repeatedly in high-risk situations. Objection, Cole interjected. Counsel is testifying. Withdrawn, Lila said smoothly, letting the implication linger without pressing further. She pivoted to her next point. Earlier, defense counsel suggested that the evidence you provided was cherry-picked. Were you aware that the classified files connected to your encrypted transmission have recently been partially declassified for this trial? The gallery collectively inhaled. Cole's head jerked up, clearly blindsided. Echo 7 nodded. I was informed this morning by my agency liaison that a redacted version was cleared for release. Lila turned back to the judge. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to submit Exhibit 27, an authenticated excerpt from the declassified mission log corresponding to the night in question. Cole shot to his feet. Objection. We've had no time to review this. Reeves raised a hand. Overruled. You'll have the opportunity to examine it during recess. The exhibit is admitted. The bailiff carried a stack of printed documents to the jury box while the digital version appeared on the court's monitor. The timestamp, 2:13 hours, glowed unmistakably beside a brief but damning entry. Visual confirmation of subject Delta, exchange of unmarked duffel with unknown accomplice. Photographic stills captured and attached. Whispers rippled through the gallery. The defendant shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Cole tried to recover his composure. Ms. Grant, even if this log is real, these so-called stills could be anyone. Let's see, Lila interrupted, clicking a remote. The monitor displayed a grainy but clear image. The defendant, caught mid-stride beside a dark sedan at the loading docks, the duffel bag visible in his hand. A collective gasp swept the room. Echo 7's voice cut through the murmurs. That's the frame I captured with the night-adapted optics I mentioned earlier. The jury's eyes darted from the screen to the defendant, then back to Echo 7. Cole cleared his throat. For the record, that image does not prove the contents of the bag. Lila tilted her head slightly. It proves presence, Mr. Cole, and proximity to the scene where an innocent man was shot minutes later. We'll address the contents of the bag in due course. She refocused on Echo 7. One more question for now. You said earlier that revealing your legal name would compromise the safety of others, but to further establish your credibility, are you willing to submit your sealed identity to the judge and defense counsel for in-camera review? The room went still. Cole blinked in surprise, caught off guard by the offer. Yes, Echo 7 said after a brief pause. I will submit to an in-camera verification by the court and counsel, on the condition that it remains sealed and off the public record. Judge Reeves's brows lifted slightly, impressed by the willingness. The court accepts that arrangement. The verification will take place in chambers at the next recess. This time it was the jurors' turn to exchange glances. Most of them looked reassured, as if a veil of mystery had just been lifted enough to expose the truth beneath. Lila offered a faint smile, then addressed the court. Your Honor, the prosecution rests its redirect for now. The judge dismissed the witness for the moment, and Echo 7 stepped down from the stand with the quiet dignity of someone who had just defended not only herself, but her entire story. In the gallery, the buzz of conversation swelled, people whispering about the photograph, the log entry, the sudden willingness to reveal her identity under seal. Cole shuffled his papers at the defense table, his earlier confidence visibly shaken. For the first time since the trial began, the balance seemed to tip away from him. As the gavel struck to announce a short break, one of the jurors leaned toward another and murmured, I believed her before. Now I'm sure she's telling the truth. The other juror nodded. That picture, it's hard to argue with that. Meanwhile, Echo 7 returned to her seat behind the prosecution table, shoulders squared yet eyes distant. She had revealed more of herself than she'd intended, but the look of relief on the jurors' faces told her it had been worth the risk. The courtroom was unusually quiet as everyone returned after the final recess. Afternoon sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, streaking the polished floor like ribbons of gold. You could feel the tension settle over the jurors as they filed back into their seats, expressions solemn and unreadable. Echo 7 sat at the prosecution's table, shoulders straight but hands folded tightly in her lap. She had faced the scrutiny of the entire court, revealed enough of herself to establish the truth, and now had nothing left to do but wait. Judge Reeves entered and took his seat, his gavel tapping once for order. Members of the jury, he said, have you reached a verdict? The foreperson, a middle-aged woman in a dark blazer, stood up. She held a folded sheet of paper in her slightly trembling hand. Yes, Your Honor, we have. The entire gallery leaned forward as the paper was handed to the bailiff and then to the judge. Reeves unfolded it slowly, scanning the words before nodding. He passed it back to the foreperson. Please read your verdict aloud, Reeves instructed. The foreperson's voice was steady despite the hush in the room. In the matter of the State versus Daniel R. Cole, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of unlawful possession and distribution of contraband materials, and guilty of conspiracy to obstruct justice in connection with the death of Aaron Blake. A collective murmur surged through the gallery, part relief, part disbelief that the weeks-long trial was finally over. The defendant lowered his head, jaw tight while his attorney's shoulders slumped in defeat. The weight of the guilty verdict seemed to settle on them like lead. Judge Reeves rapped his gavel twice to restore order. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. For now, the defendant is remanded to custody without bail. At the prosecution's table, Lila Grant allowed herself a single exhale of satisfaction. She turned to Echo 7 and gave her a quiet nod of gratitude. Across the aisle, Cole's attorney requested the usual motions for appeal, but the words felt hollow in the charged atmosphere. When the jury was dismissed, several jurors paused near the exit to glance back at Echo 7. A few offered faint smiles or respectful nods as if to say, "We believed you." Once the judge exited, the room gradually loosened. Reporters rushed toward the doors to send out breaking headlines. Anonymous witness brings down corrupt official and Echo 7. Testimony tips scales of justice. A young journalist managed to approach Echo 7 as she gathered her things. "Ma'am, if you can comment, how does it feel to know your testimony changed the outcome of this case?" Echo 7 looked up, calm as ever. "It's not about how I feel," she said. "It's about a man who lost his life and a truth that needed to be heard. Justice isn't about me." With that, she left the courtroom quietly. No triumphant speeches, no lingering for cameras, just a soldier-like figure slipping back into the crowd. Outside the courthouse, a small cluster of onlookers applauded as she stepped down the marble steps. She gave them a polite nod but kept walking, her call sign now etched in the public's memory. Meanwhile, Judge Reeves remained in his chambers, gazing at the sealed folder containing her real identity. He felt the weight of the secret he had agreed to protect. In all his decades on the bench, he couldn't recall a witness who had balanced so much personal risk with such unwavering dignity. Back inside the courtroom, the defense counsel sat alone for a moment longer, rifling through papers he knew would do little to reverse what had just unfolded. By evening, the story had already begun trending online. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Nothing's Echo 7, Justice for Aaron, and No One Above the Law. Clips of her testimony, especially the moment she calmly offered to reveal her identity in private, spread across news channels and timelines. Commentators debated her courage, while veterans groups lauded her as a symbol of integrity and service. Civil rights advocates praised the verdict as a victory for accountability. Lila Grant, in a late-night interview, summarized it best. She reminded us that truth doesn't always wear a familiar face or carry a famous name. Sometimes it arrives under a call sign, but it still deserves to be heard. As for Echo 7, she declined further media appearances, disappearing once again into a quiet, private life. But those who had been in that courtroom would never forget the poised figure on the witness stand, the calm voice that refused to break under pressure, and the way justice was finally served because she chose to speak.